Okay, so this is a piano update for your Baldwin. This type of instrument is a spinet. While we were talking earlier about the function of the piano is essentially, the touch response mechanism is essentially a miniature catapult, and you are shooting the hammer at the string and catching and reloading it. We're going to visit that metaphor again in a minute, but just to stay on the topic of what type of piano this is a spinet. On a grand piano and on a full-size upright piano, the whippen, which is the miniature catapult portion of the touch response, sits on the other end of the key. So you could imagine we have a seesaw, our fingers on one end, and our miniature catapults on the other. So the spinet, in order to facilitate a shorter body, instead of having our whippen or our miniature catapult sit on the other end of the key, it's actually suspended below it. That's your whippens down there, part of them. So they have these abstracts in order to get to the bottom of something that's suspended. Twice as many moving parts as a normal upright, and therefore repairs that would be pretty simple on an upright, loosen one screw, tighten it again, can be more complicated on a spinet. So generally speaking, you end up with a list of clicking, rattling, knocking that we choose not to do anything about because it would be more time consuming than the problem may be worth. And this piano is not terribly old, but in some instances, you run the risk of breaking parts by trying to fix them when there's all these extra moving parts in there. This type of piano can also be played from underneath because of those abstracts. Playing down here. Sorry, I'm flying blind with the camera a bit. Where are we? So that's just the type of instrument it is. The spinet was designed in response to the radio, but wasn't manufactured till decades later. The piano used to be the form of live entertainment. There was a big old upright, pretty much a grand on its side in every restaurant, and you put a hat on the piano and you had entertainment for the night. And then the radio came out and dethroned the piano. So video killed the radio star, radio killed the piano bar. And they had to figure out a way to make instruments with half the metal and half the wood, and the spinet was conceived of, but again, they didn't start making it for decades afterward. I have a couple of touch response observations that we don't want to do anything about because the piano is not settled to the floor yet. The indication for settled to the floor will be when this wheel stops free spinning. If it never stops free spinning, we're going to shim it so that the piano is nice and stable. So back to our metaphor of the miniature catapult. In order for the musician to have the most possible dynamic range, you want to have the most possible influence over over the hammer's motion. So here we have a good start area, but then you can see the hammer's pretty far from the string when we shoot the catapult. I should arrange the camera so we can get a better angle on that. Now that doesn't look like too far, but that's very far. And what that means for the musician is when you're trying to play it softly, it can't cross that great distance. And what it means for the tuner is that I'm really trying to knock it into tune. I'm trying to deliver maximum force to the wire so that I can pull out any latent motion before this pressure plate and really make it into the speaking length. So early let off is what that's referred to when our catapult is shooting too early or too far from the string. It's inconsistent on your instrument. This is A440. Meanwhile, A below it is much closer. So sometime in the piano's future, when it's settled, we may opt to correct that let-off. We may also not. It's going to depend on the musicianship. But like I said, with a spinet, stuff that could be a nice, easy adjustment on an upright can be more risky. We also have blocking hammers. And these, so again, we're the miniature catapult. We don't just shoot the hammer at the string. We have to catch it and reload it. That's a function of the back check, which arrests the rebounding hammer in place, and then as our finger gets out of the way, the firing pin of the catapult, the jack, can re-engage. In your case, we have let off that's early and back checks that are late, and it's causing blocking hammers. Let me find a good example. There's a good example. So we fire, and now we're escaped, no longer connected. But if I keep pushing, I can block the string. That's your back check, forcing the hammer. So we don't want to do anything about this until the piano is settled, because it really might square to the floor and get rid of those tiny changes. It's also a function of humidity, because the wood and the wool are swollen. So we're seeing that problem at its worst. And it might go away on its own from the wood and the wool drying out over the winter. So we don't necessarily want to do anything about it. There is an incredibly annoying crackling sound coming from probably that hinge, or maybe some veneer here that's a little loose. It's in all likelihood not going to be there when you're playing, because the desk will be closed. But it was driving me up the wall. So a really good improvement today, but the piano shifts under the down bearing changes. Let me put this somewhere so I can talk with my hands. Okay. I hope I'm in frame. So the soundboard of the piano is what we hear. We don't hear the wire. The wire doesn't move enough air. Even if I could hold it in my hands and pluck it, we wouldn't hear anything. So the wire is holding tension. Tension is transferred by down bearing through the bridges to the soundboard, and the soundboard is the speaker. It's the whole back of the instrument. It's the tabletop portion of the grand piano. And every soundboard, no matter if it's a grand or a spinet or an upright, every soundboard has a curve to it. On a grand piano, it's like an arched ceiling, and on an upright, it's like a belly pushing out. And it's designed to be at that curve so that it acts as a speaker. When the piano is out of tune for a long time, when the piano is settling from a move, the crown of that soundboard gets changed. And it takes a little while for it to settle. So you could imagine, in a really exaggerated example, let's say this piano hasn't been tuned in 10 years. That's not your piano, but an imaginary piano. So the down-bearing exertion of the strings is insufficient, and the crown of the soundboard sits in an exaggerated posture. And then I start tuning, and I'm increasing the down-bearing on this part of the crown. And then I'm tuning down here and increasing the down-bearing there. And you can imagine, as I'm moving all those wires, that the soundboard has to square under that tension. It's torquing under the changes that we've made. Your piano was not so far out the window that it was floating while I'm doing it, but we've got weather change, we've got settling to the floor, and a big move that the piano is still adjusting to. So there's a pretty good likelihood that today's tuning, while an incredible improvement, can still be improved upon later. No sooner than 3 weeks. The crown of the soundboard is going to take about 3 weeks to settle under the down bearing. There's also some tender tuning pins. These two notes that were like particularly obnoxious have tender tuning pins that will need treatment, and we want to do that in the winter. We want to do that in the aggressive part of the winter, like January, February, when the air is completely dried out. If this December is like the last 3 or 4 years, we've had 60 degrees and rain, sure, some cold nights, yes, the heat on, but not aggressive Arctic until January, February. And that's when the wood is going to really dry out. And then we talked earlier about all this real estate down here and putting mason jars in there so that they can evaporate and keep moisture in the air. And that is very effective. I'm going to show you, hopefully we're flying blind again on the video here. I'm going to show you how to take the door off. I'll try it a couple times with the camera, so let me make sure to get this. So the front door is just tongue and groove. And I'm hoping that we're seeing this. Okay, so this is tongue and groove down in the bottom here. So that's just sitting in that groove. And right now it's leaning against the legs, so it's not going to fall out. And this means that you don't have to take the door off the piano in order to put those mason jars in. You don't want to spill them, you don't want to overfill them. So whatever you can reach safely in and out, it's going to be every 10 days that you need to refill those in the aggressive winter. So January, February, when it's really evaporating. And in order to lean the door like this, so there is a friction spring right there. And you push up and lean the door out. Don't pinch your fingers. And like I said, it will lean against the leg, so you don't have to take the door off all the way. Let me see if I'm on frame there. So that's what I would recommend. Your piano, even though it's a spinet, this thing's holding like 8 tons of pressure on the wire. It is a big reservoir, and it is going to settle. In all likelihood, it's going to be this range here, the D5 octave, coming in or going out of the D5 octave. I just put the front door back on, but there's a bass bridge here, mid-range bridge there. Those are high tension. Because the piano is cross-strung, those two areas of the crown of the soundboard are reinforcing each other. And then you get up into the high end, and the wire is really short, and there's nothing cross-strung with it. So the crown of the soundboard goes to the area of least resistance. Plus, we've got this big break, and the damper check section changes. So in general, this is the range that's going to settle the most. And as far as the tender tuning pins, like this guy here, which was obnoxiously out, the pins have been driven, so you can see that they've been hammered in so that they get fresh pin block, which is appropriate, and it's not been over-driven, which would be a real problem. But the modern solution is a super thin super glue, and we would put a couple drops where the pin meets the plate, capillary action will draw it in, and it becomes a glue sizing method, filling in any cracks in any of the laminations of the pin block. We will be doing that maybe this winter, possibly the winter after, but we do want the piano to square and be settled to the floor. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns, and I will leave a business card. Thanks for reaching out. Have a great day.